What if the strangest document in ancient history isn't a myth at all? What if it's a map of something we've almost completely forgotten? Under cold museum lighting, there's a small, unassuming slab of clay resting behind glass. At a glance, it looks boring. Just another dusty artifact from ancient Mesopotamia, covered in neat little wedge-shaped marks. But when scholars first managed to read those marks in the 19th century, they realized this wasn't normal bookkeeping or a temple receipt. It was something no one expected. The tablet calmly states that before a great flood, 8 kings ruled the earth for a combined 241,200 years. Not as legend, not as poetry, as fact. It lists cities, dynasties, names, exact lengths of reign, all pressed into clay with the same careful, bureaucratic precision used for tax records and grain inventories. Whoever wrote this didn't think they were telling a campfire story. They thought they were filing history. Before we dive deeper into what that might mean, do me a quick favor. If you like these late-night dives into the strange places where history and the impossible overlap, tap the like button so more night owls can find this. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I like to imagine this quiet stretching around the planet. Tiny blue screens glowing in dark rooms, all of us sharing the same ancient question. Because this story starts in the dust. Late 19th century. Archaeologists descend on the plains of southern Iraq, into places with names like Nippur, Kish, and Larsa. What looks like barren earth from a distance turns out to be layer upon layer of old cities, stacked on top of each other like geological memory. As they dig, tablets begin to emerge from the ground. Thousands of them. Receipts, contracts, temple accounts, star charts, lists of rations, instructions for building, notes on the price of barley. A whole civilization frozen in clay. And buried among this avalanche of broken tablets, they find something different. It isn't a hymn to the gods. It isn't a merchant's ledger. It isn't a royal brag. It's a list, a king list, a chronological record of rulers, organized by city and dynasty, each reign given a precise number of years. It reads almost like a spreadsheet from 4,000 years ago, very tidy, very methodical. And that's where the problem begins, because the numbers make absolutely no sense. According to this text before the flood, kingship existed in 5 ancient cities: Eridu, Bad-Tibra, Larik, Sippar, and Shuruppak. 8 kings ruled across these cities, and together, their reigns add up to 241,200 years. Then, with one short line, the entire tone of the text shifts. Then the flood swept over. After that single sentence, everything changes. The reigns suddenly shrink. Kings no longer rule for tens of thousands of years. They rule for a few hundred, then a few dozen. Cities rise and fall on a human time scale. Battles we can date. Dynasties we can trace. Kings whose buildings and statues we've actually dug out of the ground. The text moves from cosmic time to normal time, as if someone flipped a switch. From impossible ages to recognizable history. Naturally, scholars struggle with this. Our usual picture history is gradual. One invention leading to another. Culture slowly evolving from simple to complex. You get hunter-gatherers, then small villages, then towns, then cities. Everything moves in a relatively smooth curve. The Sumerian King List does not play by those rules. It splits time into 2 separate worlds, divided by catastrophe. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns. After the flood, normal human history. So the standard explanation for a long time was simple. Okay, the pre-flood part is just mythology, exaggeration, propaganda. They inflated the numbers to make their ancient kings sound divine and important. None of that is meant to be taken seriously. Case closed, right? Except then the ground started arguing back. As archaeologists dug deeper into the cities named on the list, places like Kish and Shuruppak, they found something nobody expected. Beneath the earliest historical levels, below the oldest pottery and walls, they hit thick, sterile layers of flood-laid silt, heavy clay deposited by water, with no artifacts in it at all. No tools, no pots, no bricks, just clean, water-laid mud, sitting like a quiet bookmark between 2 worlds. Below it, an older phase of human activity. Above it, a newer city rebuilt. The flood, at least in some sense, wasn't just a metaphor. There really had been massive inundations that interrupted life in these places. And the King List, with its sharp division between before and after, suddenly lined up eerily well with what the dirt was saying. Meanwhile, another mystery was waiting in the background. The same civilization that produced this strange little tablet, Sumer, seems to appear out of nowhere around 3500 BC. The Sumerians show up with fully formed writing, advanced mathematics, complex laws, monumental architecture, city planning, and an astronomical tradition that, in some areas, rivals things we only confirm with modern instruments. There's no long, visible trail of clumsy early writing leading up to it. No gradual evolution from simple marks to complex script that we can neatly trace. It's like someone hit start on civilization at a fairly high level. And when you read the Sumerians' own texts, you notice something else. They almost never say, "We invented this." Over and over, they say they're restoring what existed before. Kingship descended from heaven. Temples are rebuilt on ancient foundations. Wisdom and order are described as things that came from before the flood. Imagine holding one of those tablets in your hands. The clay still bears the faint impressions of fingers that shaped it over 4,000 years ago. Each wedge-shaped mark was pressed slowly, deliberately, by a scribe who believed they were preserving something vital, not making up stories, but archiving memory. Their writing system, cuneiform, wasn't just a way to write sounds. It was a whole geometric language made of triangles, lines, and angles that carried layers of meaning. Through those marks, the Sumerians recorded everything: medicine, law, astronomy, myth, trade, taxes. One tablet tracks the movements of Venus with a precision we didn't fully appreciate until the 20th century. Another maps Jupiter's path across the sky. Others use base 60 mathematics to do complex calculations, the same system that still shapes our world in quiet little ways. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This doesn't feel like the shaky first steps of a baby civilization. It feels like refinement. And that brings us back to those pre-flood numbers, the ones that keep haunting researchers. Because while 241,200 years is obviously not a literal total for 8 human rulers, the numbers the scribes chose aren't random either. Because while 241,200 years is obviously not a literal total for 8 human rulers, the numbers the scribes chose aren't random either. When you break them down, you start to see a pattern. A lot of those reign lengths are exact multiples of 3,600, an ancient Sumerian unit called a sar. The sar wasn't just a big number. It was used in astronomical calculations, a way of measuring large cycles in the sky. So we have to ask, what if these figures were never meant as how long a single guy sat on a throne? What if they were something else entirely? What if those reigns were epics, not biographies, ages, time measured not in the span of one human life, but in vast cycles, cosmic intervals that the scribes squeezed into the only format they had, a list of kings. Look at what the text is doing. It's not saying, oh, and then some magical dude lived for 36,000 years. Don't worry about it. It gives you a city, a name, and a number carefully chosen in this astronomical language. It's as if each king is a label attached to a block of time, almost like saying, in the age of Alulum, centered in Eridu, 8 great cycles passed. In the age of Alaugur, 10. You can feel the intent. Order, structure, measurement. Not wild exaggeration, but encoding. And then it gets stranger when you look beyond Mesopotamia. Because this pattern, the idea of long ages, divine or semi-divine rulers, and a catastrophic break, shows up in other cultures too, separated by geography, by language, by oceans, yet somehow telling the same kind of story. In ancient Egypt, for example, we have something called the Turin Papyrus. It's a fragmentary king list written over 1,000 years after Sumerian texts, but doing something remarkably similar. It doesn't start with human pharaohs. It starts with gods ruling Egypt. Ra-Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus. These aren't presented as fairy tale characters. In that document, they're treated like actual rulers. each assigned reigns that last thousands of years. After them come the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who rule for long but shorter spans of time. Only after these long, mythic dynasties does the list shift into recognizably human kings with reign lengths that make sense on a human scale. Sound familiar? Divine rulers with immense reigns, a transitional group, then normal rulers with human lifespans. Same structure, different wardrobe. Centuries later, an Egyptian priest named Manetho wrote a history of Egypt in Greek. Once again, it starts with gods ruling for thousands of years, then demigods and spirits, and only then the first human dynasty. He presents this as chronology, not bedtime story. Mesopotamia does it. Egypt does it. Let's jump further. In India, Hindu cosmology goes even bigger. Time is divided into vast ages called yugas. There are 4 in a cycle, each one shorter and more degenerated than the last. Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, lasts 1,728,000 years. Trita Yuga lasts 1,296,000. Dvapara Yuga lasts 864,000. Kali Yuga, the age we're supposed to be in now, lasts 432,000 years. These aren't approximate, a long time ago numbers. They're exact, tightly structured, and again they're built around the same kind of base, 60 style math that runs quietly under Sumerian numbers. 432,000 shows up again and again, like a drumbeat. In these yuga cycles, humanity changes. Lifespans shorten, morality declines, knowledge fades. At the end of major cycles, the world isn't gently updated. It's reset, destroyed, and renewed. And sitting right inside that system is yet another flood story. In Hindu tradition, there's a tale of Manu, the primordial man warned by a divine fish that a great deluge is coming. He builds a boat, preserves seeds, animals, and knowledge. After the waters recede, he helps restart human civilization. If that sounds suspiciously like Noah, Utnapishtim, or Seusidra, that's because the same story form keeps surfacing. Different gods, different details, same skeleton. Over in Greece, you see it again, but compressed into a more human-scale story. The poet Hesiod describes 5 ages of humanity: the Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, the Age of Heroes, and the Iron Age. In the Golden Age, under Kronos, humans live like gods. No sickness, no toil, no aging the way we know it. It's idyllic. Then each age is a step downward. Less virtue, more struggle, shorter lives. Between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, there's a flood, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus, fed up with human corruption, sends a deluge to wipe almost everyone out. Deucalion builds a boat, survives, and afterward he and Pyrrha repopulate the world in a strange symbolic way, throwing stones that turn into human beings. Again, long better age. Decline, flood, new reduced age. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in cultures that supposedly had no contact with the old world, the same pattern appears. Mesoamerican traditions, like those of the Aztec, describe multiple suns or world ages. Each sun is a complete version of the world, with its own rules and its own inhabitants. Each one lasts thousands of years and ends catastrophically. One age ends with jaguars devouring humans. Another ends in hurricane winds, turning people into monkeys. Another ends in fire. One of the great world ages ends in a flood. After each destruction, the world is rebuilt. A new sun rises. Humanity starts again, but often in a diminished form. The Maya, with their long count calendar, also organized time into large cycles, backtons, covering spans of hundreds of years each, building up into immense blocks of time. The famous 2012 date wasn't the end of the world. It was a turning of a big cycle, an echo of the same deep, cyclical way of thinking about time. Different cultures, different symbols, different landscapes, same structure. An earlier age where beings live longer, no more, or closer to the divine. A gradual decline, a corruption, or a weakening over time. A catastrophic event, often a flood, that wipes the slate clean. A new, diminished age, where humans are weaker, shorter-lived, and more forgetful what came before. This goes way beyond just Every culture has some kind of origin story. The parallels are too specific. The idea of multiple ages, the long lifespans, the sense of a fall from a higher state, the flood as the reset button. So we're left with a tough question. Is this just convergence? Are humans, everywhere, wired to tell the same kind of story because it reflects something deep in our psychology? Or is there some kind of shared memory here? Did different cultures inherit echoes of real, deep-time events, encoded in myth, wrapped in symbolism, stretched and reshaped, but still carrying the same essential skeleton? The mainstream view is cautious. It says, floods are common, rivers overflow, coasts get hammered by storms, tsunamis hit. If you live near water, and almost all early civilizations did, you'll eventually get a big flood. Of course you'll have flood myths. And maybe that's all it is. Or maybe there's something layered going on. Local floods grafted onto older memories of much bigger changes. Stories passed down orally for thousands of years before anyone wrote them. Memories of the world before, told around fires until that world is long gone. But the structure of the story survives. Here's where the Sumerian King List becomes especially important. Because unlike most flood myths, it doesn't spin the flood as a moral sermon. There's no speech from an angry god explaining why. No long dramatic build-up. No detailed survival tale. It gives a flood one line, then the flood swept over. That's it. No drama. No dialogue. No. And so the gods taught us a lesson about being good. Just, there was a flood, and then kingship began again somewhere else on a different scale. It treats the flood not as a story to be told, but as a timeline marker, a line in the sand, like how we say before Christ / after Christ, or before the war / after the war, or even before the internet / after the internet. Everyone already knows what you mean. You don't have to explain it, which implies something quietly unsettling. Whoever this tablet was written for didn't need the flood explained. They already had that story. The King List wasn't there to tell it. It was there to connect time across it, to say, these were the ages before. Then came the break. Here's what happened after. And when you line that up with what we see in Egypt, in India, in Greece, in Mesoamerica, the Sumerian tablet stops looking like a bizarre one-off. It starts to sound like one voice in a chorus. Different melodies. Same song. There were ages before this one. They were long. They ended in catastrophe. We're living in what came after. If so many cultures remember long ages and world, ending floods, it's hard not to wonder, was there something big enough, recent enough, and real enough to sit behind all of these stories? The uncomfortable answer is yes, and it isn't fringe. It's standard geology. Between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, the Earth went through one of the most dramatic transformations in human experience. The end of the last ice age. For tens of thousands of years, massive ice sheets covered huge parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels were lower by about 120 meters. That's not just a little bit of extra beach. That's entire continents worth of extra land. Wide coastal plains. River valleys stretching far beyond today's shorelines. Habitable, fertile, populated. Then the planet warmed. Those huge ice sheets started to melt, and the water had to go somewhere. It rushed back into the oceans. Coastlines retreated. Lowlands flooded. Whole landscapes that humans had lived in for thousands of years were simply gone. Now, this didn't happen in one single year, like a movie disaster. The overall rise took millennia, but it wasn't smooth and gentle either. The meltwater came in pulses. Ice dams broke. Glacial lakes spilled. There were moments when sea level seemed to have jumped by several meters in a geologically tiny window of time. If you were living in one of those places, on a low coastal plain, by a river delta, in a sheltered bay, you wouldn't experience the end of the ice age as a slow academic graph. You'd experience it as a catastrophe. Your shoreline floods one year, then again. Sacred sites vanish. Fishing grounds disappear. Villages are swallowed. Generations tell stories. The water used to be out there. It keeps coming closer. At some point, people pack up and leave. walking inland with whatever they can carry, and their memories of a world that now lies under waves. We can see some of those lost worlds today. Take the Black Sea. There's a long, running hypothesis that around 7,600 years ago, it wasn't the large saltwater sea we know now. It may have been a much smaller freshwater lake, sitting well below global sea level. As the Mediterranean rose, it eventually overtopped the natural barrier at what's now the Bosporus. What would that have looked like from the ground? Imagine a waterfall hundreds of times more powerful than Niagara, roaring for months or years, as Mediterranean water blasted through strait and poured into the basin below. The Black Sea would have risen rapidly, flooding thousands of square kilometers of lakeside settlements, farms, and hunting grounds. An entire way of life drowned within a few generations. That specific scenario is still debated among scientists. Some evidence supports it. Other data suggest a more gradual connection. But there's no question that sea levels in that region rose dramatically. Anyone living near those shores would have watched their world shrink and then vanish. And the Black Sea is just one example. In North America, the draining of enormous glacial lakes, like Lake Agassiz, sent catastrophic floods surging across the landscape and into the oceans. These weren't gentle spring thaws. These were walls of water capable of reshaping river systems and possibly nudging global climate patterns. In Europe, as the ice retreated, river valleys were carved anew. Old channels were abandoned. Whole drainage networks changed course. But the most haunting losses aren't the rivers that changed. They're the lands that disappeared completely. For most of the Ice Age, what's now the North Sea wasn't sea at all. It was Doggerland, a wide, low-lying plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Rivers wound through it. Forests grew there. Hunter-gatherer groups lived, fished, hunted, and buried their dead there for thousands of years. Then the waters rose. Part of Doggerland drowned slowly as the ocean crept in. Another part may have gone more violently, triggered by a massive undersea landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, which likely sent tsunamis hammering into those lowlands around 8,000 years ago. Today, fishing trawlers still drag up stone tools, bones, and fragments of antler harpoons from the seabed. Little pieces of a vanished landscape. Over in Southeast Asia, the story is even larger. During the Ice Age, the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding regions were connected in a huge landmass known as Sundaland. Instead of scattered islands, you had a sweeping peninsula connecting mainland Asia to what are now the islands. Rivers flowed across what is now seafloor. Coastlines extended far out from present-day shores. As the ice melted, Sundaland flooded, first the lowest lying areas, then the river valleys, then the broad plains. What had been one continuous cultural and ecological zone fractured into thousands of islands. Genetic and linguistic evidence suggests this area was a major center of early human activity, a cradle of seafaring and coastal life. If people there had complex societies, stories, and knowledge, most of their physical traces are now underwater. The Mediterranean tells similar stories. Caves that were once above sea level now open underwater. Old shorelines lie tens of meters down. The same thing is true in countless other places around the world. And here's the key point. The best places to live early on, river mouths, fertile deltas, sheltered coasts, are exactly the places that would have drowned first. So if you imagine an early, sophisticated coastal culture with boats and trade and maybe even early forms of record keeping, the most likely result, thousands of years later, is that almost all of its physical remains will be gone. Not because it was fantasy, but because we haven't really looked under 60 meters of salt water and silt. We're basically trying to judge the whole of human history by what survived on the small portion of land that didn't flood. And then, right on the heels of these big climate shifts, something strange appears. On a hilltop in what's now southern Turkey, there's a site called Göbekli Tepe. You probably heard the name floating around by now. It dates to about 11,000 years ago, right at the end of the most dramatic phase of Ice Age melting. There, people were still officially classed as hunter-gatherers built massive stone circles out of T-shaped pillars weighing up to 10 tons. The pillars are carved with animals, abstract symbols, and what looks suspiciously like coded patterns. Some of the structures appear to be aligned with celestial events, the rising of certain stars, positions of the sun. In other words, astronomy, symbolism, monumentality, long-term planning, all from a culture that, by our old models, shouldn't be doing this yet. Even stranger, Göbekli Tepe wasn't destroyed by invaders or erosion. It was buried, intentionally. Someone, thousands of years ago, systematically backfilled the whole complex with earth and debris, almost as if they wanted to seal it, preserve it, hide it, or ritually close a chapter. Nearby sites, like Karahan Tepe and others, show similar patterns. This wasn't a one-off. It looks like a whole tradition we're just now beginning to glimpse. Now line this up. You have a world where coastlines are drowning, seas are rising, old homelands are disappearing. People are pushed inland into refuge zones, higher ground, more stable terrain. In those inland places, you subtly see monumental sites that encode symbols, animals, and sky patterns in stone. It's not hard to imagine those places as memory anchors. Temples not just to gods, but to before, to the world that was lost, to the knowledge that survivors didn't want to vanish completely. Now bring your attention back toward Mesopotamia. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf. Today it's a body of water stretching between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But when sea levels were lower, much of that area was dry land, a wide, fertile plain where the Tigris and Euphrates spread out and formed a vast delta. As the seas rose, that whole plain would have flooded. Communities living along those ancient rivers would have been forced to move upstream, further into what is now Iraq, inland, into the very region where Sumer later appears. So imagine this. People whose coastal world is drowning gradually retreat inland, carrying their myths, their rituals, their stories of what used to be. Generations later, when they finally get stable again, when the environment settles, when agriculture is reliable, when cities start to form, they start writing. And what do they say? They say kingship descended. They talk about restoration, not invention. They build temples on older foundations and carefully note that they're rebuilding what was there in ancient days. They remember a flood, plural floods. They remember that whatever came before ended. Those layers of memory show up in the ground too. Shuruppak, the last pre-flood city on the King List, has a very real, very dramatic flood layer. UR and Kish show similar breaks. These aren't global ocean, rise events anymore. They're regional catastrophes, river floods, maybe worsened by rising groundwater as the post-Ice Age climate stabilized. But if your cultural memory already carries a story of a much older world drowning, every new disaster is going to echo that trauma. Local floods get folded into older legends. Generations compress centuries. At some point, you no longer distinguish between a flood that hit us and the flood that ended the age before ours. They become one story, the flood that ended the world. The Sumerian King List starts to look like a bridge across those layers. It doesn't bother to retell the flood myth itself, that lived elsewhere in stories and epics like the tale of Zayusadra. Instead, the King List does something colder, quieter, and maybe more impressive. It tries to stitch time together, to say, there were ages before. We don't fully understand them anymore, but we know they existed. We know which cities mattered. We know there was a break. And we know that after that break, kingship began again in a different way. Somewhere, sometime, real people walked away from drowned coasts and vanished lowlands, carrying their memories inland, and eventually, those memories hardened into wedges on clay. The question is, who were they, and how much did they manage to save? To get closer to that answer, we have to look not just at the tablets themselves, but at the people who wrote them. Because the Sumerians weren't just interesting for what they recorded. They're deeply strange in how they show up. There's something very odd about their language. Sumerian is a linguistic orphan. It doesn't belong to any known family. It has no clear parent, no obvious siblings, no daughters that evolve from it later. It just appears. The language that eventually replaces it in everyday life, Akkadian, is Semitic, related to Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic. That one we can place. We can trace it. It has relatives. Sumerian doesn't. There's no Proto-Sumerian that we can point to and say, here's the rough, Simple version from 1,000 years earlier, before they refined it. The earliest Sumerian we can read, from some of the first tablets, is already complex. It has rich grammar, a wide vocabulary, and the ability to handle abstraction, law, mythology, and technical detail. It arrives in the record as a fully formed instrument, and its writing system does the same thing. Cuneiform, those wedge-shaped marks, starts around 3200 BC, after a short phase of more pictorial symbols used mostly for accounting. At first, scribes are drawing little pictures of things, jars, animals, numbers. But within a few generations, those simple pictographs have mutated into a full script. Signs that can represent sounds, ideas, and grammatical relationships. And here's the strange part. The earliest cuneiform tablets we have are already standardized. The same signs show up at different sites, Uruk, Kish, and elsewhere, like they're all following a shared system. It's not as if each city is experimenting with its own clumsy version of writing, and they slowly merge. It looks more like someone rolled out a finished concept across multiple locations in a short window of time. Most writing systems don't work that way. Egyptian hieroglyphs take centuries to move from simple symbols to a full phonetic system. Chinese script has a long, visible evolution. Mesoamerican writing, same thing. You can watch each one slowly figure out how to represent language. With Sumerian cuneiform, it's as if we open a book halfway through the series. The prologue is missing. The learning curve is implied, not shown, which raises a quiet but provocative possibility. Maybe the idea of writing, of encoding speech into marks, wasn't invented from scratch at that moment. Maybe it had been gestating in non-permanent forms for a long time before clay tablets entered the scene. Scratched on wood, inked on leather, tied into cords, drawn in sand. Materials that don't survive 5,000 years. By the time someone decided we should press this into clay and bake it, the underlying system could already have been mature. If that's true, then what we see as a sudden birth of writing might actually be the late fossilization of something much older. And the people doing that fossilizing? The scribes. Sumerian scribes weren't just literate. They were part of a highly trained, rigidly controlled elite. Their schools, Idaba, the tablet houses, were intense. Students memorized endless sign lists. They used practice tablets over and over until their wedge strokes were perfect. They copied standard texts repeatedly, drilling themselves on legal formulas, hymns, myths, and mathematical tables. Their job wasn't to improvise. It was to preserve. The scribal mindset was conservative to an almost obsessive degree. The ideal was not to create something new. It was to reproduce something old with perfect accuracy. You can see this in the way they treated Sumerian itself. Even after Sumerian stopped being a spoken language, replaced in daily life by Akkadian, it lived on in the tablet houses and temples as a sacred tongue, a Latin of Mesopotamia. For over 1,000 years after ordinary people stopped using it, scribes kept learning it, reciting it, copying it. Why keep a dead language alive for that long? Because what was written in it was considered irreplaceable. Sacred formulas, ancient hymns, old legal traditions, astronomical knowledge, all encoded in a language that was no longer evolving, fixed, canonical. If you wanted access to that deep archive, you had to learn the old tongue and the old script. There's a revealing pattern in Sumerian inscriptions, the language of restoration. Kings don't brag, I built a new temple from scratch. Over and over, they say things like, I restored the temple of so and so, which had been founded in ancient days. Or, I rebuilt it on its original foundations. Or, I returned it to its former state. Not invented, restored, returned. It's a very specific way of thinking about the past. The ideal isn't progress. It's fidelity. The good king is the one who brings things back into alignment with an earlier order, not the one who breaks with tradition. New is suspicious. Ancient is authoritative. Now think about the Sumerian King List inside that mindset. It's not a bedtime story or a piece of royal spin. It looks a lot more like a scribal project, an attempt to bring scattered, fragmentary memories of the past into a coherent chronological sequence. Different versions of the King List survive on different tablets. Some include more cities, Some give slightly different reign lengths. Some shift a few names. That tells us the scribes weren't just copying a single fixed text. They were working with various sources, and sometimes making editorial decisions. Maybe one temple archive said a king reigned 10 sars, another said 8. One tradition included a minor dynasty. Another ignored it. The scribes tried to reconcile all this into a clean, elegant structure. And yet, across all the variations, the framework remains the same. Kingship comes down from heaven. It's located in specific cities. 8 pre-flood reigns, with enormous durations. A flood sweeps over. Kingship descends again. Post-flood rulers have progressively shorter reigns in familiar cities. That skeleton doesn't change, which suggests the scribes weren't inventing that structure. They were inheriting it. The base, 60 math. The use of SAR units to measure deep time. The list of pre-flood cities. The idea of a sharp divide between 2 eras. All of that feels older than the tablets that record it, like a template they're trying to fill in, not something they created from scratch. The earliest written copies of the King List we have date to around 2100 BC. But those tablets claim to describe a timeline reaching back not just a few centuries, but into deep, almost unthinkable spans of time. Even if those numbers are symbolic, epics instead of lifetimes, the scribes are still asserting, we are preserving the structure of ages that came long before us. In a way, they're doing what we're doing with them now. They're standing at the edge of their own knowledge, looking backward into a fog of partial memory, broken records, and sacred stories, trying to draw a clean line through it all and say, this is how time unfolded. We may not understand every detail anymore, but we refuse to let the order vanish. So the King List starts to feel less like a piece of mythology and more like a compressed archive. Imagine a giant library or a long oral tradition that once laid out these ages in detail. Stories, genealogies, astronomical observations, temple records from cities that might now be underwater or buried under later ruins. Now imagine that almost all of that material is lost. What survives are on the full shelves, but the outline pinned to a wall, a master chart someone had made to organize it all. Which king in which city, for how long, in what order. The library burns, the stories fade, the rituals change, but the outline survives because it's simple, symbolic, and easy to copy. That outline is what we now call the Sumerian King List. The pre-flood portion is like a table of contents with most of the chapters missing. Each king is a heading. Each reign length is a block of time. The cities are anchors. The numbers are cosmic units. The post-flood portion slowly becomes more detailed as the scribes step closer to their own era. More sources, more inscriptions, more confidence. History comes into focus. The rough epic labels turn into names and events we can cross-check against other texts and archaeology. In that sense, the King List is doing something incredibly human. It's a group of people in the deep past trying to make sure they don't lose a thread. They knew there had been a break. They knew there had been something before. They knew catastrophe sat between their present and that earlier world. So they did what scribes do best. They took clay, and they tried to stitch time back together with wedges. They didn't understand everything they were preserving. They probably couldn't explain the full meaning of those enormous pre-flood numbers any more than we can. But they knew the pattern mattered. The structure mattered. And that's what they chose to protect. So what happens if we stop treating that structure like a bizarre mistake and start treating it like a map, not a map of rivers and mountains, but a map of time, a map of ages, of breaks, of forgotten worlds? So if the Sumerian King List isn't really biography and maybe not just myth, what if it's a map, not of land, of time, a chart of ages, markers for phases of existence, labels for worlds that rose, fell, and left only faint fingerprints in clay? When you look at it that way, everything starts to click into a new shape. Those 8 pre-flood kings stop looking like superhuman grandpas living 30,000 years each, and start looking like titles pinned to epics. Each one attached to a specific city: Eridu, Bad Tibura, Lyric, Sippar, Shuruppak. Each one lasting a precise number of SAR units, like carefully measured blocks in a cosmic calendar. Think about how we name our own stretches of time. We say the Bronze Age, the Renaissance, the Space Age. We talk about the Victorian era, or before the war, or pre-internet like they're real landscape features. We don't mean a literal person named Bronze ruling the earth. We mean the world worked a certain way then. Technology, culture, environment, all organized around a particular pattern. The Sumerian King List might be doing something similar, just with a different vocabulary. Alulum of Eridu, 8 sars. Alaugr of Eridu, 10 sars. Emenluana of Bad Tibera, 12 sars. It's not, this guy sat on a throne for 36,000 years and never got bored. It's more like, during the age of Alaugr, with Eridu as the center of kingship, 10 great cycles passed. The kings are like bookmarks. The cities are like chapter headings. The numbers are the page lengths. What if the scribes who wrote this didn't see any contradiction at all? To them, cosmic time and political order were woven together. Kingship was a cosmic principle. Descending from heaven means the structure of the world, the right way of organizing society, came down from above. Of course, you'd measure ages in the same units you use for the stars. And then we hit that line. Then the flood swept over. That one sentence is like a fault line running straight through their timeline. Before it, epochs measured in astronomical units, in the language of the sky. After it, reigns measured in human years, in the language of dynasties and city-states. The scale of the map suddenly zooms in. Before the flood, deep time. After the flood, human time. It's like scrolling a digital map from view of the whole continent down to individual streets and houses. You're still looking at the same world, but the level of resolution has changed. The King List preserves both, stacked in one document. Geologically, that pivot makes sense. The end of the Ice Age, sea level rise, drowned coasts, climate shifts, would have felt like a cosmic event to the people living through its echoes. Mythologically, we've seen the same pivot in culture after culture. Long ages, catastrophe, reset. For Sumerians, that reset gets collapsed into the flood, a single term carrying centuries of layered memory. The scribes don't need to describe the disaster in detail. They assume their audience already knows what the flood is. Their job isn't to retell it. Their job is to thread a timeline through it. And that's where the map idea really clicks into place. The King List doesn't feel like someone writing fiction. It feels like someone trying desperately to not lose track. As if they're standing at the edge of that catastrophe, looking back at fragments of older chronologies, oral traditions, temple records, astronomical tables, and saying, okay, we can't save everything, but we can at least save this. The sequence, the cities, the structure, the fact that something came before us. That's why the document feels both precise and weirdly incomplete. Precise, because it's built on real, structured thinking. Base 60 math. Repeated multiples of SAR units. Real cities you can dig up. A clear break at the flood. Incomplete, because for us, the legend is missing. We're staring at a map without the key. We can see that 28,800, 36,000, 43,200 are all sitting on some underlying grid of meaning. But we no longer know exactly what that grid represents. To the scribes, those numbers would have had an intuitive logic, just like 20th century or Middle Ages does for us. We're like people in the far future holding one scrap of a subway diagram, knowing it's important, but having no idea where the lines go anymore. And that brings us to an uncomfortable thought. If the King List is the outline of a bigger story, what happened to the story? What kind of chronologies, myths, records, and teachings did those pre-flood ages have that never made it onto clay or didn't survive the fires, floods, and conquests that followed? We already know how fragile knowledge is. Even with writing, the Romans had engineering we still admire. Concrete that sets underwater, heated floors, long-distance aqueducts. After the empire fell, much of that know-how was simply forgotten. Their roads stayed. Their buildings stayed. But the method evaporated. Medieval Europeans literally lived among ruins they couldn't replicate. The formula for Damascus steel, the legendary metal used in Middle Eastern swords, was lost. People had tried to reverse engineer it for decades. We think we're close, but we're still not entirely sure. The technique Stradivarius used to make violins with that specific haunting sound, also debated. Experimental, partially recovered, but not completely certain. And that's just in the last 1,000 years. In the space program, the Saturn V rocket took humans to the moon. It was one of the most complex machines ever built. Today, we have more powerful computers in our pockets than NASA had, but we couldn't build a Saturn V from scratch without years of expensive reconstruction. The blueprints exist, the documentation exists, but the people, the teams, the tacit knowledge, the tiny tricks that never made it into formal manuals, are gone. The living tradition broke. To do it again, we'd have to relearn. Now stretch that kind of forgetting across 5,000 years, with no backup drives, no cloud storage, no printing press. Add in floods, wars, plagues, migrations. Add in rising seas that physically erased the best coastal settlements. It's not hard to imagine whole phases of human culture being reduced to a few whispers. A flood story, a temple rebuilt on old foundations, a curious set of numbers in a king list that no one fully understands anymore, but no one dares throw away. In that light, the Sumerian King List stops being some strange outlier and starts being something more poignant, a relic of people fighting against amnesia, not just about their own time, about time itself. The scribes might not have known exactly what the pre-flood epics represented anymore. They probably couldn't have told you why those ages were measured in SAR units, or what cosmic patterns they encoded, but they knew those patterns came from somewhere older, older than their cities, older than their language, older, maybe, than their entire way of life. So they honored it the only way they could, by copying it, preserving the shape, even after the content had faded. We're used to thinking of history as a straight line, a staircase we climbed, caves to villages to cities to satellites. But the King List suggests a different picture. Not a staircase, a circle, or maybe a spiral. Ages rising, falling, resetting, knowledge blooming, then burning, coastlines drawing back, then erasing old centers and forcing new beginnings inland. Each cycle leaves behind a different pattern of ruins and stories. Some layers get written in stone. Others survive only in myths. Others leave practically nothing. Maybe Sumer wasn't the start of civilization at all. Maybe it was the first reboot that wrote things down on something tough enough to outlast the next few rounds of catastrophe. If that's true, then our 5,000 years of written history are just a visible slice in a much longer, glitchy timeline. We're not at the beginning of the story. We're somewhere in the middle, after a reset we barely remember, using tools, math, astronomy, myth structures that might themselves be hand-me-downs from people who watch their world go underwater and refuse to let everything drown with it. So when we look at that little clay tablet in a glass case and see those impossible numbers and those quiet words, then the flood swept over. We might not be looking at fantasy. We might be looking at the last, stubborn outline of a world that knew more than we think and lost more than we can imagine. And that raises one final unsettling question. If the Sumerian King List really is a map of forgotten ages, where on that map are we? Maybe to really understand what this map is pointing at, we should stop looking at the numbers for a moment and look at the places. Because the King List doesn't just give you abstract ages. It pins those ages to actual cities. Before the flood, it says kingship was in 5 places: Eridu, Tibur, Larik, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each one supposedly holds a seat of kingship for vast spans of time. Each one, in this framework, is more than just a city. It's like a capital of an age. So what happens when we go and dig into those places? Do they vanish into legend? Or does the earth remember them in its own way? Let's start with Eridu. According to the King List, this is where kingship descends from heaven first, the very beginning of organized rule. In Sumerian tradition, Eridu isn't just a city, it's the city, the archetype, the place where civilization itself is said to have started. Today, when you stand there, it's mostly a low, wind-blown mound in southern rock, surrounded by empty desert. Not exactly screaming first city at first glance. But when archaeologists excavated it in the mid-20th century, they found something extraordinary. Underneath the visible ruins, layer after layer of temple structures emerged, 18 of them, stacked one on top of another like a vertical time-lapse. Each temple built on the same sacred spot. Each one slightly larger, slightly more complex than the last. The deepest layers date back roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years. That's so far back it's before the classic Sumerian period, before cuneiform, before the cities we usually call the first. Yet even that early, people were already treating this place as holy ground. You see small mud brick shrines, carefully prepared platforms for offerings, signs of ritual activity. Someone decided, thousands of years before writing, that this exact patch of earth mattered more than the land around it. And generation after generation, through climate change, migration, and who knows what social upheavals, people kept coming back, rebuilding on the same footprint. They may not have called it Eridu yet. They probably didn't think in terms of kingship, but they knew the spot was the center of something. The King List remembers Eridu as the first seat of kingship. Archaeology remembers it as a place so sacred that people maintain continuity, there for nearly 8 millennia. Those aren't identical claims, but they rhyme. Bad Tibera, the second pre-flood city listed, is harder to see clearly. It's usually identified with a site called Tel Medina. The excavations there are partial, and the remains are badly eroded. We know people lived there in early periods. We have fragments of walls, pottery, hints of complex occupation, but not enough to reconstruct the full story. It's like a page where most of the ink has washed away, leaving just a few letters. Larak, the third city, is even more elusive. Its exact location is still debated. One candidate is modern Tel El Walaya, but that's not certain. If that identification is right, erosion and later activity have chewed up most of what might have remained. On the King List, Larak is a landmark, an epic with a name. In the ground, it's more like a whisper. Sippar, the fourth city, becomes much clearer in later history. We know it as an important cult center dedicated to the sun god Shamash. In its prime, it produced thousands of tablets, legal records, letters, astronomical texts. But those come from long after the supposed pre-flood era. The really early layers, the ones that would overlap with the King List deep time ages, are buried far beneath later construction, under meters of brick and dust. Digging down to them would be like trying to open the foundation of a modern skyscraper to see if there's a buried farmhouse under it. Technically possible, but extremely difficult and expensive. So the earliest Sippar, if it matches those cosmic ages, is still hiding. And then there's Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, the last city named before the flood, the place where kingship supposedly sat just before everything changed. Shuruppak is where the King List and the soil talk to each other most clearly. When archaeologists dug there, they found evidence of a thriving, planned city. Streets, houses with multiple rooms, storage yards, signs of specialized craft work, trade connections. This wasn't a scattered village. It was an organized urban center. And then, in the middle of the site sequence, there's a dramatic band of river-laid clay, a thick flood deposit. Above it, the city continues in a new phase. Below it, an older version of Shuruppak. Right at that break, the pottery styles shift, the architecture changes, and you can see, in literal layers of earth, that something big interrupted life there. The King List says kingship was in Shuruppak. Then the flood swept over. The mound says people lived here. Then flood. Then people lived here again. Not every site in Mesopotamia shows a neat, single flood layer. Some have multiple inundations, others none that stand out. But enough places, Kish, Uar, Shuruppak, show these bands of sterile silt separating one era of occupation from another that it's hard not to see a pattern. It's like someone ripped a page out of history, and the only thing left holding continuity together is mud and memory. Now look at what sits beneath those early historical layers. At Eridu, deep below the cuneiform tablets and familiar Sumerian cities, there are older phases, pre-literate but not primitive. There are shrines, structured spaces, signs of long-term ritual use. At Shuruppak, beneath the flood layer, there are houses and streets that predate writing but already look like a mature urban culture. Whoever lived in those layers knew how to build, organize, and trade. They just didn't leave any texts we can still read. Or maybe they did, and those texts weren't on clay. Writing doesn't have to start on tablets. It could have begun on wood, bark, leather, cloth, materials that disintegrate quickly unless they're preserved in a very specific environment. If an earlier system of record-keeping existed on perishable stuff, and its centers were in coastal or low-lying land that later flooded, we might never find a trace. The only hints would be architectural continuity, strange jumps in sophistication, and later cultures saying, "We're restoring what was before," which is exactly what we see. Temples rebuilt on the same foundations for thousands of years. Ritual patterns that outlive languages. Cities that are already complex the moment they enter written history. And scribes repeating phrases like, "I returned the shrine to its original design," or "I restored it as in ancient days." In that sense, the buildings themselves become a kind of text. Every time a temple is rebuilt on the same spot, following the same general layout, that's an act of memory. The people doing it might not know when the first version was founded. They might not know the names of the original builders, but they know this place matters. They know they're part of a chain that stretches back before any surviving tablet. And they're determined not to be the generation that breaks it. The King List is that same impulse in a different medium. The cities it names are not fantasy. We can stand on their ruins, walk their broken walls, touch the mud bricks their people shaped. Eridu was ancient even to the Sumerians. Shuruppak really did suffer a massive flood. Sippar really did become a core religious and scholarly center. We just didn't get their full story. We have the last few chapters. The earlier volumes are missing. Even today, our view of Mesopotamia is incomplete. Huge areas haven't been excavated. Political instability makes fieldwork difficult. Coastal zones that might have hosted earlier settlements are underwater. Underground water tables and the sheer cost of digging limit how deep we can go. So when we say the earliest levels we found so far go back 8,000 years, that doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing deeper. It often just means that's as far as we managed to dig before we had to stop. In other words, the archaeological record is like a partially mined library. We've opened some books. We've glanced at some pages. We've read the last few chapters of one long story. But whole wings are still closed off and some shells fell into the sea. Meanwhile, the King List is sitting there like a floor plan of that missing library. It doesn't give us the content. It doesn't tell us what those ages felt like to live through, but it hints at how long they lasted, where their centers were, and how one flowed into another until everything changed. The mud remembers in one language. The tablets remember in another. And both are saying the same quiet thing. There was a world before this one. Its city stood where the sea now moves. Its ages were longer than we can easily imagine. And when its story broke, the survivors tried very hard not to let the shape of it disappear completely. We spent a lot of time wandering through mud and myth and numbers. So what does all of this actually say about us? About where we are on that map? We like to tell ourselves a very simple story about human history. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, we were primitive, small bands, stone tools, caves. Then we figured out farming. Then we invented cities, then writing, then science, then the internet. It's tidy, linear, up and to the right. Every generation is a little smarter, a little more advanced than the one before. We think of ourselves as standing on the very top step of a long staircase, proudly looking back at how far we climbed. The Sumerian King List quietly taps us on the shoulder and says, "Are you sure it's a staircase?" Because the picture it paints, and the one echoed in Egypt, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, and in the geology of the planet, doesn't look like a single smooth line. It looks like cycles. Ages that rise, stabilize, and end. Knowledge that builds and is then buried, drowned, burned, or simply forgotten. Civilizations that don't hand the baton cleanly to the next runner, but trip, fall, and leave the next runner to pick through the wreckage for anything still usable. Maybe what we call history is just a part of the story that happened after the last big reset. Maybe Sumer's role wasn't to invent civilization from scratch, but to remember enough of what came before to reboot it. They appear suddenly around 3500 BC with complex writing, advanced math, legal codes, astronomy, and planned cities. That looks shocking if you imagine them inventing all of that from zero in a short burst. It looks very different if you imagine them as the descendants of people who watched coastlines drown, people who preserve fragments of older knowledge in rituals, stories, temple layouts, oral chronologies, and maybe non-permanent writing systems, and then, once the world finally calmed down, poured all of that into clay. In that reading, the King List isn't insane at all. It's honest. It's saying, we know there were ages before us. We know there was a flood that broke the continuity. We know that kingship, order, civilization itself had to descend again, restart, in new places with shorter lives and smaller horizons. We don't understand every detail anymore, but we remember the framework, and we will not let that framework vanish. The flood becomes less a single event and more a symbol for rupture, the moment where whatever continuous thread existed before snapped. After that, time gets relabeled, measured differently, reorganized. We do this too. We say before the accident and after the accident, before the war, after the divorce, before the fire. The event doesn't have to be a literal flood. It just has to be big enough to split your life into two. Now scale that feeling up to an entire species. Imagine generation after generation telling stories about the time the seas rose, the land sank, the world got rearranged. Their coasts are gone. Their sacred sites are underwater. Their grandparents remember a different shoreline. Their gods become bound up with that trauma. Their rituals become acts of remembrance. By the time anyone starts pressing wedge marks into clay, that whole experience has compressed into a handful of words. Before the flood and after the flood, and a weird, stubborn sequence of numbers you never change, even if you don't totally know why anymore. The King List becomes permission. Permission to entertain the idea that our timeline may not be complete. Permission to ask whether there really was nothing of significance before 5,000 years ago, or whether we're just seeing the thin top layer of a very tall stack. It doesn't prove there was a global lost civilization with flying machines and laser beams. It doesn't prove there wasn't. That's not what it's offering. It's doing something softer and, in a way, more profound. It's reminding us that forgetting is normal. Human beings forget fast. Empires fall and their engineering tricks vanish within a couple of centuries. Techniques for making metals, instruments, even rockets, can be lost in the space of a few generations. Add an environmental catastrophe, floods, earthquakes, rising seas, and it would almost be strange if nothing major had been erased before the era of stone temples and baked tablets. If that's true, then maybe a lot of what we call discovery is actually remembering. Maybe when we discover complex mathematics, we're finding patterns that older cultures knew in a form that made sense to them. Maybe when we discover astronomy, we're translating relationships between cycles that were already encoded in myth and ritual. Maybe when we encounter these weird, gigantic numbers in a king list, we're not supposed to roll our eyes and move on, but to ask, okay, what were they trying to preserve under the symbolic wrapping? Even now, we keep stumbling onto things that make our timeline feel a little too cramped. Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, with megaliths and apparent sky alignments 6,000 years before Sumer. Evidence of long-distance trade networks in the Paleolithic. Mathematical proportions embedded in very ancient architecture. Every time we dig deeper, the floor drops a little lower. Instead of a neat staircase from primitive to advanced, it starts to look more like waves, peaks and troughs. Periods of surprising sophistication in unexpected places, followed by crashes, gaps, and patchy recovery. What if the Sumerian scribes felt that already? What if they looked at their own ruins, older foundations under their temples, flood layers under their cities, and knew they were living in the aftermath of something, knew they were not the first, just the first to really lock their memories into clay? You can almost hear that realization in their language. The obsession with restoration. The idea that kingship descends twice. The matter of fact where they place their own world after flood with a kind of resigned acceptance. It's as if they're saying, we're late in the story. We come after the break. We'll do our best with what's left. And then there's us, Thousands of years later, we walk into a museum. The lights are low. The air is cool. Glass cases line the walls. We stop in front of a little clay tablet covered in sharp, tiny impressions. To most visitors, it's just a blur of marks with a label, Sumerian King List, CASON, so BC. But now, you know what might be hiding inside those wedges. Not simply a list of names, but someone's attempt to bridge a chasm in time, to keep a broken story from falling into complete silence, to say, with the tools they had, before us there was more. Don't forget that. Even if you can't see it anymore, don't pretend we were first. Imagine the scribe who wrote that particular copy, sitting cross-legged in a tablet house or a palace room, clay on their lap, stylus in hand. Maybe they're copying from an older tablet that's already cracked at the edges. Maybe some signs are smudged. Maybe they've heard their teacher talk about how the ancients measured time differently, used great cycles, when kings were closer to the divine. Maybe even they don't fully understand the numbers they're tracing, but they copy them anyway, carefully, respectfully, exactly, because somewhere in their bones, they feel what we feel when we stand in front of that glass, that there's a responsibility not to let the thread snap completely. Outside the museum, the modern city glows. Cars pass, phones buzz, satellites move overhead. We tell ourselves we're the pinnacle, the cutting edge, the farthest point from primitive man that has ever existed. And yet, above all of that, the same stars that Sumerian astronomers watch still turn in their slow, patient circles. The same base, 60 system quietly ticks away in our clocks and our angles. The same old river plains in Iraq still hold flooded layers and broken brick, and the worn remains of Eridu's temples. We're not floating above the past. We're sitting right on top of it. Maybe we're not the climax of the story. Maybe we're living like the Sumerians, in another chapter after forgetting, proud of our rediscoveries, half aware that we don't have the full script. And maybe that's okay, because you don't have to solve the king list to let it change you. You just have to let it ask its questions. What if history is a straight line forward? What if the beginning we're so sure about is actually just the last recovery phase after reset? What if our job isn't just to push further into the future, but to listen more carefully to the faint echoes coming from behind us? To pay attention when an old clay tablet whispers, "There were ages before yours. The world has ended and restarted before. Remember that. Remember how easy it is to lose almost everything." And then, in the quiet that follows, you might find yourself looking up at the night sky a little differently, not just as a backdrop, but as a clock, not just as a clock, but as an archive, not just as an archive, but as a mirror, showing you that you're part of a story that stretches much further back than your textbooks admit. So now, as you're lying there with this in your headphones, or playing in the background while your room glows softly around you, I'll leave you with a few questions. When you think about the Sumerian King List now, what do you see? A piece of mythology? A scrambled record of real epics? A warning label on our own belief in progress? Do you think we're the first advanced civilization Earth has hosted? Or just the first one to store our memory on plastic and silicon instead of clay and stone? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is, and what you think the King List really is. Mythology? Encoded history? Or something in between that we don't yet have words for? Maybe, between all our perspectives, we can reconstruct just a little bit more of what those old scribes were trying so hard to keep alive. Until next time, sleep well. And if you dream tonight, maybe you'll find yourself walking not just through ruins, but through ages we've forgotten. And if you do dream of those forgotten ages, here's a final thought to drift off with. One day, we will be the ancient ones. If some distant future digs through the rubble of our time, they're not going to see the way we see ourselves, videos and notifications, and streaming and memes. They'll see fragments. Whatever manages to survive fire, flood, corrosion, and simple neglect. Bits of plastic, twisted metal, concrete bones of our cities. Maybe a few carefully guarded digital archives. If anybody remembers how to read the formats. Maybe a handful of inscriptions we carved into something tougher than glass and silicon. If they're anything like us, they'll try to make sense of what's left. They'll build timelines. They'll argue over what came before what. They'll stand in front of museum cases, looking at whatever scraps of our world they've managed to rescue, and they'll ask the same questions we're asking about the Sumerian scribes. How much did these people really know? Did they understand more than we're giving them credit for? Where does their story actually begin? And here's the uncomfortable symmetry. From their point of view, we might look like a sudden spike followed by a mysterious gap. Imagine if most of our digital memory doesn't make it. Servers corrode. Hard drives become unreadable. Optical disks delaminate. Cloud data disappears when the companies behind them dissolve. What's left is mostly physical. Buildings, roads, the odd carved monument, maybe a plaque or two, maybe some stone or metal structures meant to warn about nuclear waste. To that future archaeologist, it might look like this for hundreds of thousands of years. Simple tools and scattered settlements. Then suddenly, highways, skyscrapers, global architecture. And then silence, a break in continuity, a reset. If we're unlucky or just normal in the grand cycle of history, they might find the ruins of our cities sitting under silt or shallow seas, the way we see forgotten shorelines now. They'll find evidence of rising temperatures, shifting coastlines, mass extinction, and they might tell stories of an age when humans pushed their world too hard and forced another reset. Somewhere in that retelling, there may be a shorthand phrase for us the way before the flood works for the Sumerians, before the warming, before the collapse, before the silence. Maybe they'll have their own version of a king list, or something like it, a structured way of remembering phases. The age of machines, the age of networks, the age of fragmentation. Maybe our leaders will be compressed into symbols, archetypes, epics. Maybe the faces we plaster on billboards and broadcasts will shrink into a couple of names at the top of an old chart that some tired student is forced to memorize. And if those future scribes are anything like the ones who wrote the Sumerian King List, they won't think of themselves as the first. They'll talk about restoration. 2. They'll rebuild on our foundations, literally and culturally, inheriting our buried infrastructure, our forgotten engineering, our half-decayed myths. They might marvel at how much we knew about the cosmos, and how badly we misjudged our place in it. They'll notice that we mapped the background radiation of the universe, measured galaxies billions of light years away, decoded the genome of our own species, and also stacked our coastal cities right at the edge of rising seas, as if we'd never listened to a flood myth in our lives. To them, we might look a bit like the people we study now, strangely brilliant, strangely blind. And they'll ask themselves the same things we're asking about the Sumerian scribes. Were they inventing everything from nothing? Or were they rebuilding from older, broken pieces? How many times did this story start over before it got to us? In that sense, the King List isn't just about Sumer. It's a mirror. It asks us how we're organizing our own memory. What are we writing in materials that last? And what are we trusting to fragile systems that might not survive even one major disruption? Are we carving anything into metaphorical clay? Or are we assuming our cloud backups will be there forever? We tend to think of data loss in terms of a broken phone or a crashed hard drive. Archaeology thinks in terms of continents of data, entire civilizations, reduced to a few surviving artifacts. When you zoom out that far, the Sumerian King List feels less like a bizarre relic and more like a success story. Against all odds, some pattern of their deep past did make it through. Not cleanly, not fully, but enough that, thousands of years later, we're still reading it, still wondering what they were trying to say. If we're lucky, some of our pattern will make it through, too. Maybe a future child will stare at a chunk of engraved metal or a stone monument describing constellations, prime numbers, or the structure of DNA and realize they weren't stupid. They just dropped the thread. And maybe that child will grow up to be their world's version of scribe, piecing together timelines, reconstructing cycles, trying to understand how many times the story of civilization has been written and erased and written again. When you think about it that way, the King List becomes strangely comforting. Yes, it hints at amnesia, at loss, at floods that wipe away whole chapters of knowledge, but it also hints at resilience. People survived. They regrouped. They rebuilt. They carried forward something, not everything, but enough Enough to remember that there were ages before. Enough to leave a clue for us in a handful of baked tablets. We, too, are leaving clues. Some intentional, some accidental. Some will survive. Most won't. So the real question the King List leaves us with might not be, what exactly happened before the flood? It might be, what are you passing forward? What do you know or feel or value? That's worth preserving through whatever small or large floods your life encounters. What patterns do you want to restore when things break? What stories about being human are you writing? On clay, in code, in the way you live, that someone centuries from now might recognize as a thread worth following. Because somewhere in some future museum, someone might be standing in front of the remains of our age. They'll be tired. It'll be late. The lights will be dim. And they'll lean a little closer to a cracked artifact from our time, trying to hear what we were saying. And maybe, just like us with the Sumerian King List, they'll feel that strange tug, that sense that history isn't as straight as we pretended, that the past still has more layers than we've uncovered, that we're all living in the middle of a story much older and much stranger than we've allowed ourselves to believe. If that thought keeps you awake a little longer, don't worry, you're in good company. There have always been people sitting up late, staring at marks on clay or marks on screens, try to remember what the world once was, and wondering what someday will be left of us. Now, really let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, and if the dreams come, maybe tonight, they'll carry you not just backward in time, but forward to some distant archive where someone is reading our age like a mystery and asking the same quiet question we've been circling all along. How much have we forgotten? And how much are we still capable of remembering? So maybe here's where we pull back one last time and look at the whole thing from above. On one side, you've got the strict no-nonsense view. The Sumerian King List is mythology layered onto early history. The pre-flood section is just divine branding. The long rains are symbolic. The flood is a narrative device, and we shouldn't read anything more into it than ancient people like big numbers and dramatic stories. On the other side, you got the more adventurous reading. The King List is a compressed record of real epics. The kings are names for ages, the numbers are astronomical codes, and the flood marks an actual global transition. Something tied to the end of the Ice Age, sea level rise, and the drowning of early coastal cultures. The document is a surviving fragment of a much older system for tracking time. Most people stand somewhere in between. Maybe the pre-flood part is myth, but myth built on faint memories of real disasters. Maybe those giant numbers are symbolic and mathematically meaningful. Maybe the flood isn't one event, but the echo of many blended into one story that anchored their sense of before and after. Where you land says as much about how you see the world as it does about ancient Mesopotamia. If you're a skeptic at heart, you might lean toward the simplest explanation. Humans make patterns out of chaos, mythologize floods because rivers flood all the time, and inflate the past because the old days always feel bigger, better, and more mysterious than the present. If you're more open to mystery, you might look at the shared patterns between cultures, the repeating numbers, the archaeology, the climate science, and think, maybe they knew something we don't. Maybe we're not starting at zero. Both instincts are valid. The point of the King List isn't to force you into one camp or the other. It's to remind you that the past isn't as small or as simple as we like to package it. Think about how we normally talk about ancient people. We flatten them into stereotypes. Superstitious, unscientific, primitive, fumbling in the dark. Then you pick up one of their tablets and find base, 60 math, advanced star charts, subtle literary structures, a time-keeping system that still underpins ours, and a timeline so ambitious it tries to span from cosmic ages to local warlords on one piece of clay. These were not children. They were looking at the same sky we look at, watching the same planets trace their slow, repeating loops, feeling the same fear when rivers rose higher than they'd ever seen, when seasons shifted, when familiar coastlines vanished. They were trying to fit all of that into a story that made sense, so they could live inside it without going insane. In that sense, the Sumerian King List is less about kings and more about coping with the knowledge that the world changes in ways far bigger than any one lifetime. Coping with the realization that whatever stability you enjoy is temporary. Coping with a nagging suspicion that you're living after something important has already been lost. You and I know that feeling, too. We feel it when we talk about pre-internet and post-internet, before COVID and after COVID, before the climate crisis, and after it started to bite. We're already writing our own king list in miniature, drawing invisible lines in our lives where time seems to split into different worlds. That's why this little clay tablet hits so deep. It isn't just a weird relic from the distant past. It's a reflection of how humans, in any age, try to hang on to meaning when things break. The Sumerian scribes didn't know we'd be sitting here thousands of years later, listening to their work in bed on glowing rectangles. They weren't writing for us. They were writing for themselves, for their own students, their own kings, their own sense of continuity. And yet, the fact that their clay survived and that we can still hear their structure means that some part of what they tried to do worked. They didn't save the full story of the ages before the flood. They didn't preserve every teaching, every technology, every myth. But they saved enough for us to feel the outline and ask, wait, what came before this? That question alone is powerful, because as soon as you ask about the past, you start to ask it about the present. What are we carrying from earlier ages without realizing it? Little inherited assumptions about time, about progress, about what counts as advanced. Old mythologies disguised as modern common sense. Ancient fears wearing new clothes. And what are we losing right now that we don't recognize as lost yet? Languages blinking out quietly. Ecosystems collapsing in the background. Small, local ways of knowing the world that don't fit into our data-driven, globalized systems. Those Sumerian scribes had no idea which parts of their culture would matter most to people far in the future. They just wrote what felt essential. The structure of time, the sequence of kingship, the fact of the flood. We're in the same position. We don't know what someone thousands of years from now, if anyone is around to look, will wish we had saved. We just have to decide what feels worth carving into our equivalent of clay. How we treat each other, how we see the earth, how we understand our place in the cycles we're part of. So, after all of this wandering through temples and flood layers and cosmic numbers, the King List leaves us with surprisingly practical takeaway. Don't be too sure you're at the beginning of anything. Don't be too sure you're at the end, either. You're somewhere in the middle of a story that's been reset more than once. And your choices, what you remember, what you forget, what you pass on, shape how the next version of that story gets told. If you've made it this far with me, in the quiet of your room, phone glowing, eyes maybe a little heavier than when we started, thank you for staying in the mystery. Before you drift off, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. When you think about the Sumerian King List now, what feels most likely to you? Is it just mythology, clever but symbolic? Encoded history, hiding real epics in cosmic numbers? Or this strange in-between space where myth and memory blur and both are trying to hold on to something real? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is, and which way you're leaning. Because somewhere, in some small way, we're doing exactly what those ancient scribes did. Sharing fragments, comparing perspectives, trying not to let the thread snap. Until next time, sleep well. And if your dreams take you walking along some vanished shoreline, or standing in a temple at Eridu, or watching the waters rise over a world you love, remember, you're not just dreaming backward. You might be dreaming in both directions at once, into ages we've forgotten, and into ages still waiting to be remembered. Imagine we're back where we started. A quiet museum, white walls, soft lights, that little clay tablet, sitting behind glass, just being its small, unimpressive self. No soundtrack, no narration, just an object from 4,000 years ago with wedge marks pressed into its surface by a hand that's been dust for millennia. To most people walking by, it barely registers. A quick glance. Old writing. Move on. But now you know what might be inside it. A story of two worlds, one before the flood, one after, a memory that stretches time so far it stops feeling human. Ages measured in cosmic units. Cities treated as anchors in deep time. An invisible catastrophe, sitting in the middle like a crack in a mirror. You know that somewhere out on the plains of Iraq, the ruins of Eridu are still catching the wind, that Shuruppak still hides its flood layer under the dust, that Göbekli Tepe's buried pillars still hold their carved animals and their quiet alignments with the sky. You know that beneath our feet, and beneath the sea, there are entire landscapes where people once stood, once talked, once watched the water creep closer, and didn't yet realize they were living in a chapter that would later be summarized in just 4 words. Then the flood swept over. You also know that our usual version of history, that clean, confident timeline, is probably more like a sketch than a finished drawing, that there might be whole eras missing, that the ground is littered with questions we haven't even thought to ask. And somewhere in all of that, in this very ordinary moment where you're just lying in bed or scrolling on your phone, you're connected to it. Not metaphorically, literally, the same planet, the same sky, the same cycles. Our clocks still quietly run on Sumerian-style thinking, base 60 minutes and seconds. Our geometry still slices circles into 360 degrees. Our days are still measured by the turning of the same earth those scribes stood on, under the same constellations they watched. We're using a newer interface. They had clay and reed styluses. You have glass and touchscreen. But the questions haven't changed as much as we'd like to think. Where did we come from, really? How many times has the story reset? How much have we forgotten? How much are we pretending we didn't forget? If the Sumerian King List is anything, it's a refusal. A refusal to let the past dissolve completely. A refusal to act like time started with them. A refusal to pretend the flood was just a story and not a line that split their world in two. In that sense, maybe the most advanced thing they did wasn't invent writing or math or city planning. Maybe the most advanced thing they did was admit they weren't first. We struggle with that. We like to imagine we're the cutting edge, the most enlightened, the furthest any human has ever been from superstition and ignorance. The idea that someone thousands of years ago might have understood something deep about cycles and catastrophes, a way of structuring time that we've mostly lost, makes us a little uncomfortable. But that discomfort can be useful. It can make you more careful when you're sure, more curious when something doesn't fit neatly, more open to the possibility that myth sometimes means memory in disguise. It doesn't mean you have to believe every wild claim about lost super civilizations. It doesn't mean you have to throw out science or embrace conspiracy. It just means you leave a little space at the edge of your mental map where the label shifts from known to not yet understood. That's where tablets like this live, in that fuzzy zone where numbers don't behave. Flood stories rhyme with geology, and different cultures that should have nothing in common keep whispering the same patterns. We can't interview the scribes. We can't ask them, hey, when you wrote 28,800 years, what were you really talking about? We can't stand in Eridu 8,000 years ago and watch the first shrine go up on that hill. We can't sit at the edge of an ice age shoreline and ask the people watching the waves rise what they think is happening. But we can do this. We can let their fragments bother us in a good way. We can let the King List stand in our minds as a reminder that not all impossibilities are nonsense. Some are code. Not all myths are fiction. Some are warped memory. Not all beginnings are true beginnings. Some are just the parts that survived. And we can make choices now, in our own tiny window of time, about what we choose to preserve. Maybe for you, that's literal. Learning old languages, studying history, supporting science, care about archives and libraries and oral traditions before they vanish. Maybe it's more personal, being a better memory, keeper in your own life, writing things down, telling stories, passing on something other than stress and noise to the people who come after you. In the end, every civilization is made of scribes and listeners. Some people press the marks onto clay, into paper, into code, into songs, into stories. Other people receive them, react to them, mutate them, carry them forward. Right now, in this quiet moment, you're on the listener side of that equation. You've spent this time letting an ancient tablet breathe in your imagination. You've walked through drowned coastlines and buried temples without leaving your bed. You've opened yourself, even just a little, to the idea that we might not know where the real edges of our story are. That's not nothing. The scribes who carefully copied the King List would probably be surprised we're still reading it. But I like to imagine that if they could see you now, half asleep, headphones on, eyes heavy, but still hanging on to the last few sentences, they'd feel a kind of quiet relief, because it means their refusal worked. Time didn't swallow everything. A little clay tablet made it across the flood, across many floods, and ended up here in your night. And now the question that haunted them belongs to you too. What do you think the Sumerian King List really is? A myth dressed up like a spreadsheet? A fragmented roadmap of real forgotten ages? A warning label pinned to human history that says, this hasn't just happened once? Drop your thoughts in the comments, even if it's just a gut feeling. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read as many as I can, and I love seeing this invisible web of night owls stretched across the world, all thinking about the same tiny, stubborn piece of clay. For now, let the questions drift to the back of your mind. Let your breathing slow. Let the edges of your room fade a little. Out beyond your walls, the stars are still turning. The same cycles are still ticking. And somewhere in a quiet gallery or a storage vault, that little tablet is still there, its wedge marks locked in place, still carrying the memory of a world that ended and another that began. Until next time, sleep well and dream, if you can, not just of the ages we've forgotten, but of the ones that might still be waiting to be remembered. So before we finally let this night go, let's flip the question one last time. We've spent all this time asking, what do the Sumerians remember? But there's another question hiding behind that. What are we leaving behind that someone else might one day try to read the way we're reading them? Think about how much of our world is invisible if you don't have the right key. If you handed someone from 5,000 years ago a smartphone with no power, no internet, no context, it's just a shiny, dead rock. All of the photos, books, movies, music, messages, maps, memories gone, as far as they're concerned. Zero information. Just an object. Now imagine the same thing, but flipped. What if there was some earlier culture whose smartphones were made of things that didn't last? Wood, textiles, organic materials, maybe even something we wouldn't recognize as tech at all. To us, their world might look like a patch of odd stones and some strange alignments, while the real information is quietly dissolved back into the earth. We're not used to thinking that way. We assume that if a thing is impressive enough, it leaves big ruins. But most of what matters in a civilization isn't stone. It's ideas, relationships, skills passed from hand to hand, ways of seeing the world that never needed to be written down because everybody already knew them. When those threads break, all that's left are hints. A temple rebuilt on older foundations. A flood story told in 3 different rivers. A list of kings measured in impossible years. And that's another place the Sumerian King List nudges us. It suggests that somebody thought long, carefully about time, about how to compress it, about how to carry it. They might not have been able to preserve the content of every age, but they saved the pattern. Ages before, flood, ages after. You can almost feel the triage in that choice. Like someone saying, okay, we can't drag the whole library through the fire, but we can carry the index. We can carry the spine. We can carry enough that someone, someday, will know there was more. And now here we are, thousands of years later, still haunted by that skeleton outline. We don't know what Alulim's age felt like. We don't know what stories they told under those older skies, or what music they played, or how they explained the world to their children. We don't know why those exact cities mattered, or how their kingship really worked. But we know this. They existed. They ended, and someone loved their memory enough to measure it, name it, and pass it on. So the King List does something subtle to your sense of self. It takes you from the feeling of, we're the main story, to something more humble. We're one of the later chapters. We're walking through a world that's already been edited a few times. We're inheriting patterns we didn't design. That can feel unsettling at first, almost like vertigo, but it can also be strangely grounding. Because if there have been resets before, floods, collapses, forgotten ages, and the fact that we're here at all means humans are very, very hard to erase. We break, but we also rebuild. We forget, but we also remember in sideways ways. Myths, rhythms, rituals, shapes. The Sumerian scribes didn't know a thing about plate tectonics, Milankovitch cycles, or meltwater pulses. They weren't running climate models on supercomputers, but they knew what survival felt like. They knew what it meant to live in the shadow of something the world barely remembered, and they chose to respond not with silence, but with structure, even if their structure is one we now only half understand. Maybe that's the real invitation tucked into those wedge marks. Not believe this literally, not turn this into a dogma, but simply don't be lazy about time. Don't assume your present is the whole picture. Don't assume the past was simple. Don't assume collapse is the same as ending. Honor the fact that other ages existed, and that future ages will probably look back at you the way you're looking back at them. So, if you zoom all the way out, the Sumerian King List leaves us with three big possibilities. It's mythology, a sophisticated story that uses numbers and cities as symbols to express ideas about cosmic order, divine kingship, and human limitation. In this case, its truth is poetic, not literal, but it still tells us how deeply ancient people thought about cycles and catastrophe. It's encoded history, a compressed record of real epics, measured in astronomical units, tied to actual environmental transitions and shifts in centers of power. In this case, it's one of the oldest surviving attempts to create a deep time timeline, an ancient version of our graphs and chronologies. It's both myth and memory braided together. Real disasters, real resets, real migrations wrapped in symbolic language, filtered through ritual, retold for generations until a line between this literally happened. And this is how we explain our place in it. Becomes beautifully blurry. Personally, I think that third option, the in between one, is where most of human truth lives. Not in pure facts, not in pure stories, but in that strange twilight zone where facts become stories, and stories become a way facts survive. The Sumerian King List is twilight. It's wedged between myth and archive, between temple and spreadsheet, between singing the past and counting it. And now it lives in your twilight, too, the sleepy space between curiosity and dreaming. So as you finally let this play out and your mind starts to sink a little deeper towards sleep, just hold on to one simple image. A hand, 4,000 years ago, pressing a stylus into wet clay. No internet, no lights, no satellites, just lamplight, maybe, crickets, a quiet room, and someone patiently copying. After kingship descended from heaven, it was an Eridu, then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, line after line, wedge after wedge, trusting that even if everything else failed, these marks might carry something forward. And they did, all the way to right now, to your headphones, to your room, to this moment. If you like, share your theory in the comments before you drift off. Do you think the Sumerian King List is mostly myth, mostly memory, or a ghost of something in between? And where are you listening from in this long looping story? What time is it in your little corner of the timeline? Wherever you are, and whenever this finds you, thank you for walking through these forgotten ages with me. Until next time, sleep well, and dream not just a lost world behind us, but a possibility that we are always living on the edge between what's remembered and what will one day have to be rediscovered. If you're still here, still awake, still letting these thoughts circle slowly in the dark, let's linger just a little longer. Not in the museum this time. Not in ancient Mesopotamia. Right here where you are. In your room, on your couch, on that bus, under your blanket, wherever you're listening from. Because all of this, the flood myths, the buried cities, the clay tablets, is really circling one quiet idea. You are living in someone else's after. There were people who looked at their own ruined foundations and thought, we're so far from the beginning. Everything important already happened. To them, the golden ages were behind them, the world before the flood, the time when gods walked closer, when kings ruled for Sar after Sar, when the stars told stories they no longer fully understood. And yet, from our point of view, they are the beginning of so much. They're the first ones whose words we can really read, not just guess at, the first ones whose mathematics we can reconstruct, whose city plans we can trace, whose legal codes we can recognize. They thought they were late. We think they were early. Both are true in different frames. That's the strange thing about living inside a timeline. You never quite know where you are on it. So try a little experiment with me. Close your eyes for a moment, if you can. Picture a line stretching out in front of you and behind you. Not a neat ruler with numbers, just a faint glowing thread. Behind you are all the ages you've ever heard about. Ice Age hunters, drowned coastlines, buried temples, the first scribes, long-forgotten wars, plagues, empires, collapses, rebuilds. Somewhere way back there, a hand is pressing a stylus into wet clay, writing. After kingship descended from heaven, it was an Eridu. That same thread passes through them, through Babylon and Egypt and Göbekli Tepe, through Doggerland and Sunderland, and all the flooded worlds whose names we don't even have, through the people who told flood stories around fires. Try and make sense of water where land used to be. The line runs on, through philosophers and farmers, through ships and caravans, through printing presses and telescopes and electricity. And then it comes up through your floor, through the buildings and streets and cables of your city, right into the device you're holding right now. You are standing on that line. In a few thousand years, if anyone is still here, they won't see your whole life the way you do. They won't see your scrolling or your group chats or that weird video that made you laugh yesterday. They'll see a little point on that line labeled with something vague. The digital age, the network era, the time before the collapse, the age of carbon. To them, you will be part of an epic, not an individual. The way Alulum is to us, the way before the flood is to us. But for you, this is just your evening, the cup on your table, the hum of traffic, the way your blanket feels, the messages you still haven't answered, the way your brain won't shut up. The scale doesn't match. It never does. That's why those Sumerian numbers felt so impossible at first. We're trying to stretch our little human sense of a long time across cosmic cycles and flooded coasts. So instead of trying to force it to match, just let both exist. You are small. You are also standing in the middle of something unimaginably vast. You are one person. You are also, in a very real way, the living continuation of every scribe, every builder, every storyteller who decided, I don't want this to disappear. Because that's what you're doing right now just by listening. You're keeping a question alive, not solving it, not pinning it down, just refusing to let it vanish. Is the Sumerian King List a myth? A memory? A map? That's the kind of question that keeps humanity interesting. We don't just eat and sleep and work. We dig. We wonder. We argue with tablets. We look at mud and think, okay, but what if there was more? The scribes did it in their way. You're doing it in yours. And someday, somebody else might do it to us. They might dig up a buried server farm, find a handful of intact files, and argue about whether they're sacred scripture, entertainment, or incomprehensible gibberish. They might find a monument aimed at warning future generations about radioactive waste, and treat it like a myth about angry gods underground. They might be right and wrong at the same time, just like we are with the King List. That's okay, because maybe the goal isn't to get every detail right. Maybe the goal is just to keep asking, to keep listening to the weird places where myth and geology and math and memory all overlap, to ask, what if this isn't just a story? And also ask, what if the story itself is the way the truth survived? So as you drift towards sleep, if you do, you don't have to come to a verdict. You don't have to decide tonight whether the Sumerian King List is pure mythology, encoded history, or some liminal thing in between. You can just hold the image, a tiny clay tablet, a long line of time, a flood between two worlds, and you lying here at the far end of that line, for now, listening to its echo. If you want to, let your thoughts soften around a few questions. What if some of the myths in your own life are actually memories you've labeled incorrectly? What if some of the things you're absolutely sure about look as strange to the future as 241,200-year king reigns look to us? And what would you write down if you knew a flood was coming, not of water, but of forgetting? Let those questions get blurry at the edges. They don't need sharp answers. They're not exam questions. They're more like constellations, patterns you notice in the dark that help you feel oriented. Even if you don't know exactly what they're made of. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If they're not, that's fine too. You can replay this in the back of your mind as background noise while you scroll a little more. Either way, you've walked with me from museum glass to Mesopotamian mud, from drowned coastlines to future ruins, from a list of impossible kings to the realization that every age thinks it's the main event. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real gift of that strange little tablet. Not certainty, not proof, just a gentle nudge that says, be humble about your place in the story. Be curious about what came before. And be kind to whoever has to read the ruins you leave behind. If you haven't already, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing the dots on this modern king list of ours. Names, locations, tiny reigns of insomnia and curiosity scattered around the world. And tell me, if you like, in one line, what you think the Sumerian King List really is. Mythology, encoded history, or something in that haunting space between. Whatever your answer, thank you for being part of this age and for sharing this little stretch of the timeline with me tonight. Sleep well, and if the flood of thoughts gets too loud, remember there were others long before you, lying awake under older skies, wondering about the same strange thing. Where does our story actually begin?